All right, so today we're diving into something pretty fascinating and honestly, a little unnerving at times, AI ethics.
Yeah, it can be a bit of a rabbit hole.
Right, we're specifically looking at this thing called the Decolonial Intelligence Algorithmic Framework.
DIA framework, for sure.
Exactly, DIA framework. And this isn't just about, making AI fair on the surface.
It goes much deeper than that. It forces us to confront this uncomfortable truth about how tech, even with good intentions, can actually end up mirroring and magnifying the power imbalances that already exist in society.
It's true. And you know what really drives that home for me? Those automatic soap dispensers, remember those? The ones that had trouble detecting darker skin tone.
Oh, right, yeah. That caused quite a stir.
It's such a seemingly small thing, a soap dispenser, but it blew up because it revealed this much bigger issue. The potential for bias to seep into even the most ordinary tech we interact with every day.
It's a stark example of how tech that we think of as neutral can actually inherit and even amplify the inequalities that are already present. And what's so interesting is that this isn't even a new phenomenon. Think about it. Just as colonial powers historically extracted resources without a thought for the communities they were taking from, we see data being collected in a similar way today, often from marginalized groups without their consent or any benefit to them.
Like history repeating itself, but in the digital realm.
Ex-
And that's where this DIA framework comes in. It's tackling those historical power imbalances head on, but in the world of AI. So let's unpack it. This framework has four main pillars, and the first one is decolonizing data collection. Sounds pretty intense. What's the core idea there?
It really challenges this ingrained assumption that data collection is inherently objective, like it's just a neutral process. This pillar forces developers to recognize that every single step, who's gathering the data, whose voices are being included or excluded, even the methods of collection, all of that carries enormous weight.
Right, like even the questions you ask can have a bias baked in.
Absolutely, and it can all perpetuate those biases if it's left unchecked.
So this is about making sure that from the get-go, marginalized communities have a seat at the table, that their data isn't just being taken and analyzed without context or their input.
You got it. This framework is all about advocating for community-led audits of data collection, ensuring that the entire process is ethical, respectful, and truly representative of the communities that the AI is supposed to be serving.
And when we're talking about community here, we're not just talking about like geographic communities, right? This is about communities of identity, shared experience.
Absolutely. It's about capturing the full spectrum of human experience, not just this narrow slice.
Which so often is a privileged slice.
Exactly. This is fundamental to building AI that is truly equitable, truly just.
Right, so that's pillar one, decolonizing the data itself. Pillar two is all about algorithmic transparency and accountability. No more black boxes, it seems. So break that down for me.
Think about it like a magic trick. If you're trying to understand how it's done, but the magician refuses to show you their methods, it's frustrating. Right.
The word.
This pillar demands that AI's decision-making processes are crystal clear, well-documented, and understandable even if you're not a coding whiz.
So it's about making sure that the curtain's pulled back, everyone can see how the sausage is made, so to speak,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to decisions that impact their lives.
That's the heart of it.
Okay, so transparency is huge, but it's not enough on its own, is it? That's where the accountability piece comes in.
Exactly. It's not just enough to know how the AI works. People need to be able to challenge it, to hold the developers accountable if those algorithms are leading to unfair or even harmful outcomes.
It's about giving people a voice, some recourse, which traditionally hasn't been the case in AI.
And shifting those power dynamics that have been so imbalanced for so long.
I love that. Democratizing AI.
Yeah.
Okay, on to pillar three. This one feels especially relevant today. Intersectional impact assessment. It feels like we're constantly being reminded that identities are complex, layered, not so simple. What's at the core of this one?
It boils down to the understanding that bias isn't one size fits all. We have to move beyond these simplistic categories and really consider how various forms of discrimination based on race, gender, ability, all of it, how those intersect and create unique vulnerabilities.
Because we can't just say, okay, we've addressed gender bias and call it a day. We need to be asked, but for whom have we addressed it? Who are we still leaving behind?
Precisely. It's about recognizing those nuances and pushing developers to think critically about how their AI might impact different groups in different ways. A truly inclusive AI takes those intersections into account.
Okay, last but not least, let's talk about pillar number 4, decolonial AI governance and accountability mechanisms. This one sounds like it gets to the core of who holds the power in shaping the future of AI.
Exactly. This pillar acknowledges that right now, the power to develop and deploy AI is concentrated in the hands of very few.
And those hands mostly belong to the global north.
Exactly. And this lack of representation has huge consequences.
Well, because whoever controls the technology is inevitably going to be embedding their values, their priorities into that technology. So it stands to reason that other perspectives, other ways of seeing the world might get overlooked, maybe even erased completely. So how does this framework suggest we fix that power imbalance?
It starts by asking those tough questions. Whose values are being baked into this AI? Whose problems are we even considering worthy of solving? And whose voices are completely missing from this conversation? The DIA framework pushes for a complete shift in who sits at the table when it comes to governing AI.
So let's talk about ethics in the abstract and more about putting the power to actually shape those ethics into the hands of those who've been historically excluded.
Precisely. It's about moving away from this top-down, exclusive approach and toward a more collaborative, just, and globally representative model of AI governance.
I love that. Okay, so we've got these 4 pillars, a solid framework for building and governing AI in a way that dismantles those historical power imbalances.
Yeah.
But it's all well and good to talk about this theoretically. How does this actually play out in the real world? This paper we're looking at mentions some really interesting case studies.
It does. The author of this framework, Christian Ortiz, has actually developed this AI system called Justice AI.
Justice AI. I like the sound of that.
Right. It's designed to address the very biases we've been talking about.
So what can Justice AI do that your average AI can't? What sets it apart?
Well, first off, it's trained on a vastly more diverse and representative data set. The paper mentions over 560 experts from all kinds of fields, medicine, law, education, all contributing, with a real emphasis on making sure BIPOC communities are well represented.
So it's not just about more data. It's about the right kind of data.
Exactly. Data that reflects a broader range of lived experiences, different ways of seeing the world.
Which I imagine changes how this AI analyzes situations and comes up with solutions.
Hugely. And the paper gives this example from a dermatology office where Justice AI helped correct misdiagnoses of skin conditions in BIPOC patients.
Whoa, seriously? You're telling me even in a field like medicine where we expect objectivity, these biases can still creep in?
Oh, absolutely. A lot of medical AI is trained on data that heavily favors white patients, which means it might not be as accurate when it's trying to diagnose conditions on darker skin tones, which can have really serious consequences.
That's a scary thought. A misdiagnosis could mean someone gets the wrong treatment, or even worse, no treatment at all.
Exactly. And that's where Justice AI comes in. Because it's been trained on data that includes a range of skin tones and those perspectives from medical experts within those communities, it was able to flag those misdiagnoses and actually advocate for more culturally competent care.
That's amazing. It's like, finally, we have an AI that's not just repeating the biases of the past, but actively trying to correct them. But I'm guessing the applications of Justice AI go way beyond just healthcare, right?
You're right. The paper also talks about Justice AI being used to address microaggressions and unconscious bias right in the workplace.
Now, that's something a lot of people can relate to. Navigating those dynamics, especially when it comes to microaggressions, it can be so tricky. What happened in this case?
So there was this situation. A white man made a comment to his black female colleague about her tone. And whether he intended it or not, it played into that harmful stereotype of the angry black woman.
Oh, yeah. We all know that one. Incredibly damaging.
Right. And in this case, the woman thankfully felt comfortable enough to call him out on it. But he was totally confused. He genuinely didn't get what he'd done wrong.
Which, unfortunately, isn't uncommon. Sometimes people don't realize how their words, even with good intentions, can cause real harm.
Exactly. So unsure of what to do, he turns to Justice AI for guidance. And this is where it gets interesting. Instead of just giving him some generic definition of microaggressions, Justice AI takes a much more nuanced approach.
It's like it was actually trying to help him understand the impact of his actions.
Precisely. It walked him through why his comment was problematic, connecting it back to the larger historical and social context to help him understand the deeper implications of what he said. It even gave him resources to learn more about microaggressions and racial bias.
It's like having a super patient, very well-informed friend who can help you unpack these complex issues.
And the best part, it worked. The man was able to really understand how his words had affected his colleague and took steps to educate himself and do better.
I love that. That's AI being used in such a positive way, not just identifying problems, but empowering people to grow and do better.
Yeah.
But it sounds like Justice AI's reach goes even beyond individual interactions, right?
Absolutely. The paper also highlights this fascinating case study involving the real estate market. Justice AI was given this seemingly straightforward listing for a luxury apartment, something many people wouldn't think twice about.
Okay, let me guess. It was full of all that coded language, those subtle cues that can actually alienate potential buyers from diverse backgrounds.
Spot on. Even those seemingly harmless phrases you often see in those types of listings can carry implicit biases. Justice AI was able to dissect the listing, highlighting how language that might appear neutral at first glance could actually be very unwelcoming to people from different backgrounds.
We've all seen those listings. They scream, "You don't belong here," without ever explicitly saying it.
Exactly. And the amazing thing is that Justice AI didn't just point out the problems, it actually offered solutions. It rewrote the whole listing, focusing on inclusivity, accessibility, and even things like environmental sustainability.
So it wasn't just about identifying bias. It was about dismantling that bias
Yeah.
and creating something better.
Exactly. It took those core pillars of the DIA framework, decolonizing the data, promoting transparency, embracing intersectionality, and showed how they can be put into practice to actually create real change.
I love that this isn't just theoretical, it's giving us a practical roadmap, but I have a feeling we're just scratching the surface here. What other areas have been touched by Justice AI?
The final case study in the paper focuses on something I think a lot of people can relate to, even if they haven't experienced it personally: systemic bias in the workplace. In this case, Justice AI took a deep dive into the practices of a global insurance company and, no surprises here, uncovered some pretty major problems.
Okay, color me intrigued. What kind of problems are we talking about in the context of insurance?
Well, for starters, there was this glaring lack of representation, especially when it came to BIPOC employees, particularly in higher level positions. Very few BIPOC individuals, particularly in their sales division.
Sadly, that's not all that surprising. It's a pattern we see across so many industries.
It is. And as Justice AI dug deeper, it became clear that the issues went beyond just representation. The company heavily relied on this commission-only pay structure, which, as you can imagine, puts people from marginalized communities who often lack the same financial safety nets at a huge disadvantage.
It's setting them up to fail from the start. Without a base salary, it's incredibly hard to weather the ups and downs of sales, especially when you're already up against these systemic barriers.
And as if that wasn't enough, Justice AI found that BIPOC agents often faced bias from the clients themselves. They were frequently passed over for higher value clients, and some even experienced blatant discrimination right on sales calls.
It's like they were being hit with a double dose of bias from inside their own company and from the clients they were trying to serve.
It's the perfect illustration of how deeply ingrained systemic bias is, operating on multiple levels and creating this cycle that can feel impossible to break.
So how do you even begin to untangle something like that? To address something as deeply rooted as systemic bias within an entire global corporation? What did Justice AI suggest?
Well, Justice AI didn't just throw its hands up and say it's impossible. It actually offered concrete solutions. First and foremost, it called for a total revamp of the company's recruiting strategies.
So moving away from just relying on referrals or those job boards that often just perpetuate a homogenous workforce.
Exactly. Justice AI recommended that they actively seek out talent in places they may have overlooked before, and even partner with organizations dedicated to supporting BIPOC professionals. It also suggested incentivizing current employees to refer candidates from underrepresented backgrounds.
I love that. It's about being proactive, being intentional, about diversifying your networks, not just waiting for the right people to magically show up.
And the recommendations didn't stop there. Justice AI recognized that diversifying the workforce is only one piece of the puzzle. To address those compensation disparities, it suggested moving away from that commission-only model and offering all employees, especially BIPOC employees, a base salary.
Providing a safety net, some stability, that can make a world of difference.
Right. And because true equity needs a multifaceted approach, Justice AI went even further, advocating for dedicated mentorship programs specifically designed for BIPOC employees.
Recognizing that mentorship and guidance from more experienced folks is invaluable.
Exactly. It's about creating this culture where everyone feels supported and empowered to succeed, not just those who come in already having advantages.
That's what I love about this. It's so holistic. But what about the client-facing side of things? How do you tackle the bias those BIPOC agents were facing from clients?
Well, to tackle that, Justice AI proposed a system where client assignments were randomized. That way, all agents, no matter their race or background, would have an equal shot at building a successful client base.
Such a simple but elegant solution. It levels the playing field, removes the potential for unconscious bias to creep into those initial interactions.
Exactly. It's about creating a fairer system both internally for the employees and externally in how the company interacts with its clients.
What's so inspiring is that they're not just talking about change, they're actually implementing it.
Yeah.
It gives me hope.
It's the power of the DIA framework and Justice AI in action. It shows how important it is to take a multi-pronged approach, addressing the problem on multiple levels, if you want to create real, lasting change.
This whole conversation has me feeling hopeful. This decolonial intelligence algorithmic framework in Justice AI, it's like a breath of fresh air in a tech landscape that often feels ethically murky. It's like, finally, someone is using this powerful tech for good to solve real-world problems and in a way that centers equity and justice.
It makes you wonder, if we can do this in healthcare, employment, even real estate, what other areas could benefit from this decolonial approach to AI?
It's a great question, and one I hope our listeners are thinking about, too. If we can acknowledge that even those algorithms that seem totally objective can still harbor and even perpetuate our biases, what does that mean for the future of AI? What kind of world do we want to create with this tech?
Those are the big questions we need to grapple with.
There are big, but I think this framework gives us a really solid place to start. It's a roadmap to make sure AI becomes a tool for good, for liberation, for empowerment, not for oppression or exclusion.
Absolutely. It's a call to action for everyone, developers, policymakers, educators, you and me, everyone, really. We all have a responsibility to examine the role AI plays in our lives and fight for a more just and ethical technological future.
Couldn't agree more.
You know, one thing you hear a lot about these kinds of frameworks is, well, it's all good in theory, but putting it into practice, that's the real challenge.
Right, going from what to how. So how do we actually scale these principles, make them work in the real world?
The million-dollar question.
Because it's one thing to build a justice AI in a lab, but to actually tackle systemic bias across entire industries,
It's a whole other ballgame.
that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But it seems like this DIA framework is more than just some idealistic wish list. It actually gives us steps, concrete things we can do.
It does, yeah.
So where do we even start? What are the biggest hurdles to actually implementing this thing more broadly?
Well, I think the first hurdle is just awareness. A lot of people, even people working in tech, they just don't realize how easily bias can worm its way into AI.
It's insidious.
So education, raising awareness, that's got to be step one.
Because you can't fix what you don't acknowledge, right?
Mm-hmm.
We all need to be on the same page about the problem before we can even start talking solutions.
100%. And with awareness, you got to have buy-in. This can't just be academics and ethicists chatting in their ivory tower. We need tech companies, policymakers, even the average person on board.
Because at the end of the day, this tech is going to touch all of our lives.
Exactly. And that's where it gets really tricky. Because as much as tech companies are talking about ethical AI now, there's still that profit motive.
Yeah, the bottom line.
So finding ways to incentivize ethical AI, whether it's through regulation, through public pressure, market forces, whatever it takes.
Shifting that mindset from ethics as an afterthought to ethics as a core design principle.
Exactly. And that's not going to be a quick fix. It requires a totally different way of thinking about tech, valuing tech. But there are signs things are moving in the right direction.
Okay, so we need awareness, buy-in. But what about the nuts and bolts of actually implementing something like the DIA framework? It's complex. Where do you even begin to put that into practice?
You're right. It's not like you just download an app and you're good to go. It's a whole system. It has to be woven into every single stage of how AI is made and used. But the DIA framework does give some really practical guidance. Like when it comes to decolonizing data collection, it really stresses community engagement.
So the communities most impacted by an AI need to be involved in the process from the very beginning.
100%. And not just as data points. Partnering with them, really listening to what data is collected, how it's used.
So it's about really shifting power, right? Giving those communities a voice, agency. They're not just passive bystanders.
Exactly. And that community engagement, it can't just be a one-time thing either. It needs to carry through to all the other pillars of the framework. Like with algorithmic transparency, it's not enough to just make the code public. It has to be accessible. People need to understand it.
Which could mean like actually translating that technical jargon into plain English, right? Providing resources and support so people can wrap their heads around how these algorithms actually work.
Exactly. It's about democratizing access to information, giving people the tools to have those meaningful conversations.
This is all great, but I'm hearing this and thinking, this takes time, resources, a serious commitment. Do you really think we're going to see this kind of adoption? That companies are really going to put in the work?
It's a huge challenge, no doubt. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Implementing this kind of framework, any framework that puts ethics and justice first, it's a massive shift. It's not going to be easy or quick.
It sounds like we're talking about a fundamental change in how we as a society even approach technology.
In many ways, yes. But I think it's crucial to remember that this isn't just about finding some technical solution. This is about those deep-seated societal issues of power, of equity, of who gets a seat at the table.
Because in the end, tech is a mirror, right?
Yeah,
If we want tech that's more just, more equitable, we have to start with ourselves.
precisely. The DIA framework, it's both a reflection of our own biases and a potential way out. It forces us to face those biases head-on and imagine something better, a world where technology uplifts, where it empowers instead of marginalizing.
I love that vision. And honestly, after everything we've talked about, I'm feeling hopeful that it's possible. But are there actual examples of this being done successfully on a large scale? Or is this more of an aspiration for now?
That's the question everyone's wrestling with, right? Justice AI, these initiatives in the paper, they're a good sign. But scaling that up, that's another beast.
Because it's not just the tech itself, right? It's changing attitudes, shifting power, creating a culture that actually values ethics and justice.
Exactly. And that takes time, dedication, a real willingness to shake things up.
Yeah.
But the stakes are just too high to ignore. The choices we make now about AI, they're going to shape everything.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? All the different angles to this. AI is already complex, but then you add in all the ethical stuff, the potential for bias, how it's going to impact society.
It's a lot to unpack.
It really is. So as we start to wrap up our deep dive here, I'm wondering, we've been talking about this DIA framework, Justice AI, these potential solutions to make AI more just, more equitable. But are there any potential downsides, unintended consequences we should be considering?
It's such an important question. Anytime you're talking about something as powerful, as potentially transformative as AI, you've got to look at both sides, the good and the bad.
Right, like every action has an equal and opposite reaction or however that goes. So playing devil's advocate here, what are some of the potential downsides of a framework like this?
Well, one concern that comes up a lot is the potential for misinterpretation, even misapplication of the framework itself.
How so? What do you mean?
So take that principle of community engagement we talked about. Super important to get those impacted communities involved, but
It's got to be genuine.
yes, exactly. It can't just be checking a box like, oh, we talked to a couple people from that community, we're good. It has to be real partnership, an ongoing dialogue, a willingness to actually incorporate that community feedback.
Because otherwise it's just performative, not actual change.
Exactly. And that ties into something else we discussed, shifting those power dynamics.
Yeah.
It's not enough to just invite marginalized communities to the table. We have to make sure they're actually heard, that their voices matter.
That their expertise is valued. Because lived experience, that's a form of expertise that often gets overlooked in tech.
Absolutely. Another thing to watch out for is tokenism.
Oh, right. Like including a few diverse faces, checking that diversity box, but not actually giving those people a real voice in the decisions being made.
Exactly. Diversity without inclusion, it's meaningless. It's about creating an environment where everyone feels safe to speak up, challenge assumptions, where they can bring their whole selves to the table.
It's about moving beyond representation to true equity. That's a big ask.
It is. It's a huge undertaking. But we can't afford to ignore the ethical side of AI. The stakes are too high.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to remember, doing nothing, that's not an option either. Those biases we've been talking about, they're already baked into so much of the AI that impacts our lives every day, often in ways we don't even realize. So while this is complex, frameworks like the DIA, systems like Justice AI, they offer a starting point.
A way forward.
Yes, exactly. They give us tools to start dismantling those harmful systems and building something better.
And it's on all of us, researchers, developers, policymakers, everyone, to get involved in these conversations, to demand better.
Absolutely. And on that note, I think it's time we emerge from our deep dive into decolonial AI. What a journey, right?
It's been a whirlwind.
Eye-opening, for sure. And honestly, I'm feeling hopeful. We've covered a lot, those historical roots of bias in tech, the potential of the DIA framework, those inspiring examples of Justice AI tackling real-world problems. But this isn't the end of the conversation, right? I hope this deep dive inspires you to keep learning, keep asking those tough questions, and really think critically about the role AI plays in your own life and in the world. Because in the end, the future of AI, that's not something that's going to be decided for us. It's something we all have a hand in shaping.
Well said. It's in our hands to make sure AI reflects our shared values: justice, equity, human dignity.
And that's a wrap on this episode of The Deep Dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a better future for everyone.